Yes.
Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon session about security proofs. My name is Tetsu Iwata, chairing this session, and we have 3 talks in this session. The first talk is about on the quantum security of OCB. The work is by Balloon Madam, Daniel Masni, Shikoha Patranabis, Srinivasan Laglaman, and the talk will be given by Balloon.
Thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Varun, and I'll be talking about the quantum security of OCB. I know that this session is on security proofs, but my talk will mostly consist of attacks, and maybe let's see how far we get so that we can discuss a bit about the proof as well. By now we all know the devastating effects quantum computers will have on public key crypto systems. This is why NIST started the process of selecting new cryptographic standards that can withstand attacks from such quantum computers. However, the standards fall under the category of asymmetric key cryptography, mainly public key encryption schemes and digital signatures. So one might ask, what about symmetric key cryptography? So why are there no such similar standardization efforts in this category? So a likely reason for this is that the cryptographic community for a long time believed that the best one could do to attack a symmetric key crypto system in the quantum setting is to use something known as Grover's algorithm. Now, Grover's quantum algorithm on a very high level allows you to recover an n-bit secret key from a space of all possible 2 to the n keys in time roughly of the order 2 to the power n over 2. So mainly we only get a quadratic speedup compared to a classical brute force search, but we don't get quite the exponential speedup that we get if we are using Shor's algorithm. So that's why the community thought that to keep symmetric crypto systems secure in the quantum setting, you just need to double the key length from n bits to 2n bits. But that viewpoint somehow changed in 2010 when Kuakado and Mori, they came up with a polynomial time distinguishing attack against a standard Feistel cipher, wherein the distinguisher could somehow query the cipher on a quantum superposition of inputs. And Feistel cipher is actually a classically secure cipher, but now we have a polynomial time quantum attack. Is it? Okay, sorry. Okay, good pun. So this quickly led to a number of follow-up papers, with each paper coming up with efficient quantum attacks against different symmetric crypto systems. And a common theme of all such attacks is that they use so-called Simon's algorithm, which is another popular quantum algorithm like Shor's and Grover's. Now, Simon's algorithm essentially allows us to solve the following problem. So we are given black box access to a function f with n-bit inputs and n-bit outputs, and it is a periodic function where the period is secret, and the problem is to just recover the period. Now, if you're allowed to make quantum queries to the function f, then Simon's algorithm allows us to recover this period in only O of n queries to the function. In contrast, if you only had classical access, then this problem probably takes 2 to the n by 2 number of queries. So again, this is another example where we have an exponential speedup over a classical solution. And on a very high level, the way Simon's algorithm works is that each time you make a quantum query to the function f, you get back an n-bit vector as an output, and this vector is perpendicular to the period each time. So you have a fixed period S and you recover O of n vectors perpendicular to it, then you solve a linear system of equations and you recover your period. And the starting point of our work was this paper by Kaplan et al. In 2016, which showed that using Simon's algorithm, you can break the integrity of various standard block cipher modes of operation in the quantum setting, which includes the authenticated encryption scheme OCB, which will be the main focus of my talk. Now, OCB is a popular block cipher mode of authenticated encryption, which is quite well known for its efficiency. So to encrypt a message of L blocks, OCB only requires L calls to the underlying block cipher. So OCB consists of 3 versions. So OCB1, which is listed as an IEEE standard for protecting data over wireless networks. OCB2, which was an ISO standard for authenticated encryption. It is no longer a standard because we probably know, some of us probably know that it was shown to be broken in a classical setting in 2019. And OCB3, which is an IETF internet standard. So now let's dive a bit into the technical specification of the OCB versions. So they follow a similar structure when it comes to encrypting a message. So say, given a message, you first partition it into a number of blocks. And then all the 3 OCB versions, they compute a certain value known as the initial offset, denoted as delta 0 on this slide. So this delta 0 depends on the nonce. And one thing that's worth noting here is that this value is supposed to be a secret. And we crucially exploit this in our quantum attacks because, spoiler alert, in a quantum setting, this delta 0 will no longer be a secret. And then using this initial offset, we calculate a bunch of offsets where the ith offset is used, it's used to encrypt the ith message block, as shown here. And then finally, the individual message blocks are added up to compute a checksum, and this checksum and the associated data is processed to form the authentication tag. Now, let's first see how Kaplan et al. Broke the integrity of the OCB versions in a quantum setting. So, so one thing worth noting here is that, like in QA code, like in previous work, we assume that the adversary has quantum access to the OCB encryption oracle. Now, of course, discussing the validity of this assumption, we consider it beyond the scope of this work. So the key idea we use here is that given quantum access to such an encryption oracle, we define a function f, which takes n-bit inputs and n-bit outputs, on top of which we will apply Simon's algorithm later on. And the key idea is that we should define our function f so that if we recover the period of f, this should allow us to attack the integrity of OCB. So here the function that we define, that Kaplan et al. Define, is that on input and n-bit message block, you first run the OCB encryption on a 2-block message, m and m, and then you get back a 2-block ciphertext. So f of m is defined as C1 XOR C2. And it's not hard to see that that is a closed form expression you get for the function f. Now, if you look at it closely, if you look at the EK terms, then it's not hard to see that the function is periodic, with period being the first offset XORed with the second offset. And one crucial thing to note here is that in OCB1 and OCB3, this XOR is sort of independent of the nonce, even though the individual offsets depend on the nonce. So specifically in OCB1 and OCB3, this period will be a fixed multiple of a value EK of 0. And this is quite important because this allows us to use Simon's algorithm to recover this period f. Because if you remember, in Simon's algorithm, you make multiple queries to the function f. So indirectly, you're making multiple queries to the OCB encryption functionality. But each time you make a query to the OCB function, the nonce is changing. So the function f is itself changing. But this won't be a problem because the period is fixed. So across all invocations of Simon's algorithm, so each step you get a perpendicular vector perpendicular to this fixed period, which allows you to just use linear algebra to recover the period. And then it's not hard to see that once you obtain this period, this should allow us to launch some existential forgeries against the OCB versions, as shown on this slide. So the details are not quite important for the purpose of this presentation, but what's important to note here is that Simon's algorithm allows us to recover this period, which is a multiple of EK0. So effectively, we also recovered the value EK of 0. So this brings us to our first contribution, wherein we observed that the prior integrity attacks against OCB versions can also be used to attack confidentiality in the quantum setting as well. So even in a weak adversarial setting where the nonces are not in our control. So on a very meta level, our work is quite similar in spirit to the classical break of OCB2. Because the way OCB2 was broken was first a team of researchers came up with some integrity attacks against OCB2, and then subsequently another team found out that these attacks can be extended to break confidentiality as well. So in some sense, our work can be seen as a quantum analog of their work. So more technically, we showed that OCB1 and OCB3 do not satisfy a certain notion of quantum security known as INT-QCPA. So INT-QCPA can be seen as a quantum analog of the standard INT-CPA notion. So in the security game, the adversary is allowed to make ask for encryption of quantum messages in superposition. But one small thing to note here is that in the classical challenge phase, you still have to submit 2 classical messages of the same length. Because otherwise, if you're also allowed to make quantum queries in the challenge phase, then it turns out that no encryption scheme can satisfy this notion of security because of a phenomenon known as quantum entanglement. So our attacks against OCB1 and OCB3, they exploit the fact that in OCB, the final block messages are somehow processed in a different fashion. So we'll be seeing what I mean by that shortly when we discuss our in-QCP attack against OCB1. So here you can see that the intermediate message blocks are processed like this, whereas the final block message is processed in a one-time pad fashion. So on a high level, our attack proceeds in 2 phases. So first, in the quantum phase, where we have quantum access to the encryption functionality. So again, using Simon's algorithm, as we have seen in the integrity attack before, we recover this value EQ of 0. And then the rest of our attack is purely classical. So first, in the challenge phase, we pick 2 single block messages of a very peculiar form. So M0 star is defined as n XOR L over 2, where n is the block length. We'll see shortly why we pick such messages. And after receiving the challenge ciphertext, we guess that M0 star was encrypted by the challenger if Z XOR M0 star equals to the tag. Now, the reason this attack works is because let's say M0 star was encrypted, and let's run through the steps of the encryption algorithm. So we can ignore these M loops because it's a single block message. Then it's not hard to see that the paths that I've highlighted here and here, they're essentially both equal to M0 star. In this case, you can see that the length is nothing but n. So n XOR L by 2 should remind you of M0 star. So this is nothing but M0 star XOR the first offset. So ym is EK of M0 star XOR the mth offset. And similarly, if you look at this part, so because of this one-time pad thingy going on, so this is nothing but again M0 star. So EK is nothing but again M0 star XOR the first offset. So to summarize, if M0 star was encrypted, then ym will be equal to the tag. But since we don't have direct access to this ym, because of again one-time pad encryption, so ym is nothing but cm XOR mm. So you just need to check the equation that is the ciphertext XOR m gives me the tag or not. And in this whole attack, note that the adversary did not need to work with the nonces at any step. And this attack can be extended to break OCB3 in a similar fashion as well, where instead of working with single block messages, we need to work with two block messages. But I won't be going into the details. Now, in the interesting part comes when we analyze OCB2. So if we try to extend the previous attack to break OCB2, it's not so straightforward to extend the attacks, because in our previous attacks against OCB1 and OCB3, the Simon's algorithm gives us this value EK of 0. But however, if you want to use Simon's algorithm in the same fashion, in this case, the period will be a multiple of this value L, which is EK of the nonce. So the value L is changing each time you try to run Simon's algorithm at each step. So it's like the period itself is changing at each step, so you don't get any meaningful output back from Simon's algorithm. However, if you focus on how OCB2 processes the associated data, then it gives us some hope of attacking the scheme in a quantum fashion. Namely, this time, if you focus on, stop using the cursor. If you focus on how the associated data is processed in OCB2, nowhere is a nonce used. And not only that, but even our friend EK of 0 is somehow embedded in the subroutine. So now we'll see how we use this observation to break in-QCP security of OCB2. So again, on a high level, if we have quantum access to the encryption functionality, then we have indirect quantum access to this PMAX subroutine, which will allow us to recover EK of 0 using Simon's algorithm. But then how do we go on from there? Because if you recall in the challenge phase, for OCB1, we somehow picked messages which depended on this value L. But in this case, L is not a fixed value, but it's always changing constantly. So in the challenge phase, even if we knew which nonce will be used by the challenger, we a priori do not know what the value L is going to be about. We only know L for EK of 0. So unless the nonce is equal to 0, we don't have any hopes of going further than that. So this brings us to the second key idea we used in our attack, where we exploited the fact that we still have quantum access to the encryption oracle even after the challenge phase. So on a high level, what we did was, after the challenge phase, we computed the value L equals EK of nonce, which was used in the challenge phase, using yet another quantum algorithm known as Deutsch's algorithm. In fact, we show something stronger. So we show that using this Deutsch's algorithm, we actually gain an ability known as raw block cipher access, or in other words, we gain the ability to evaluate the underlying block cipher EK on arbitrary inputs of our choice. So you can see that this actually gives us, so not only can we break in-QCP security, but we can do all kinds of things. Again, I won't be going through the details, but they can be found in our paper. However, just making this talk, I guess I need to update our paper a bit because for this raw block cipher access, we need to make an extra assumption. The assumption being that the tags output by OCB2 are not truncated. Because it was recently brought to our attention that our original in-QCP attack against OCB2 in the paper somehow inherently uses this assumption. Because if the truncation of the tags were done by a significant amount, then it appears that our attack does not extend in a straightforward fashion. And we leave it as an open question to extend our attack for this generalized case. And we thank Melanie for pointing this out. She's a bachelor student at ETH. Yeah, so finally, if you take a step back, then our attack against OCB2 somehow crucially exploited the fact that associated data is processed in a nonce-independent fashion. But what if we remove this ability to query associated data from the adversary? Then it turns out that not only do the attacks do not work, but in the paper, we formally prove that OCB2 in this restricted setting is actually in-QCP secure, of course, assuming that the underlying block cipher is quantum secure. Now, a few remarks about this result. So in this restricted setting where you're not allowed to query associated data at all, so OCB1 and OCB3 are still insecure because our attacks, if you recall from a few slides back, then they do not use associated data anywhere. So it's a bit surprising that OCB2, which is classically broken, seems to be more secure than OCB1 and OCB3 in this quantum setting. But our results are not really a contradiction because it was shown in the 2019 paper that OCB2 is classically in CCA insecure, but from an in-CPA point of view, it is still secure. And what we did in our work is to just extend this in-CPA result to the quantum setting. So to give an intuition behind our proof of quantum security, it first helps to look at the classical proof of security. So the classical in-CPA proof for OCB2 does not look at OCB2 as a block cipher mode of operation, but instead as a tweakable block cipher mode of operation. So where OCB2 uses so-called XEX tweakable block cipher, and in the classical setting, if you assume that the underlying block cipher is a secure PRP, then XEX is indistinguishable from a so-called tweakable uniform random permutation. And in OCB2, it turns out that if you replace all instances of XEX with such permutations, then it makes our job easier in solving the improving the in-CPA security. Unfortunately, in the quantum setting, Kaplan et al. Showed that XEX is an insecure tweakable block cipher in the quantum setting, even if the underlying block cipher is a secure quantum secure PRP. But there is a subtle issue here. So Kaplan et al. In their attack, they look at XEX as in isolation, and they don't really consider how XEX is actually used in OCB2. But we extend their attack to also show that XEX remains insecure even in the OCB2 setting. So to summarize, to have any hopes of proving the in-QCPA security of OCB2, we must take a step back and again look at it as a block cipher mode of operation, while potentially relying on the quantum security of the PRP, the block cipher E. And this is exactly what we did. So we mainly borrowed techniques from Anand et al., which were in turn used to show the in-QCPA security of the CBC mode. Again, the formal details can be found in our paper for those interested. So to summarize my talk, so when OCB2 and OCB3 are used in a random nonce setting as AEAD modes, then we show that OCB2 and OCB3 are insecure in the quantum setting, where we demonstrated this with concrete attacks. But I mean, for OCB2, we had to make an extra assumption that the tags are untruncated. And this does not apply to OCB1 because functionally it is not an AEAD mode. It does not use associated data anywhere. And now instead, if OCB2 and OCB3 are used as pure AE modes, then it turns out that surprisingly OCB2 is a secure scheme. We again showed this with a concrete proof. And finally, this is not something I covered in my talk, but now if OCB2 is again used as a pure AE scheme, but this time in a strong adversarial setting where the adversary is allowed to pick nonces in an adaptive and non-repeating fashion, then we showed that OCB2 can be broken in an in-QCPS sense using only a single quantum encryption query. On a very high level, we adapted a quantum forgery attack by Baumick et al. Against a variant of OCB to break confidentiality of OCB2 in this setting. Yeah, that brings to the end of my talk. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. So are there any comments or questions from Kobe? Any questions from Beijing? Maybe I have one. So if I look at the slides, no scheme can achieve the security against adaptive nonces.
Yeah.
And is there any hope for achieving this notion, or it seems to be difficult to obtain positive result?
So that's a good question. So this exact paper at Asia Crypt, essentially what they do is they come up with a new mode, which is a variant of OCB, which offers security not quite against adaptive nonces, but non-adaptive nonces, where in the security game, the adversary first pre-specifies a list of nonsense he would use in the game. But against adaptive nonsense, yeah, I'm not so sure.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from Beijing? So let's thank the speaker again. Okay, the next talk is about indifferentiability of the sponge construction with a restricted number of message blocks. The work is by Charlotte Lefebvre, and Charlotte will give that talk.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you for the introduction. So today I will present a result regarding indifferentiability of the sponge construction when the number of message block is restricted. The sponge construction is a popular method for hashing purposes, and at a high-level view, it operates on a state of size b bits and relies on a cryptographic permutation of the same size. Then the state is split into two parts. The first one is called the outer part. It is made out of R bits, and R is also called the rate. Then we have the inner part, which comprises C bits, and C is also called the capacity. Now, in order to process a message, we first split the padded message into R bit blocks, and these blocks are added one by one to the outer part of the state, and this is interleaved with permutation evaluations. Once all message blocks have been absorbed, we can move on to the squeezing phase, where R bits of the digest are extracted at a time, and after each extraction, the permutation is applied on the entire state. So here we focus on a generalization of the sponge where the rate when squeezing is allowed to be larger than the rate when absorbing. And it was introduced in the context of the photon scheme. I will use the conventional graph notation of the sponge where nodes represent the b-bit states of the sponge, and we draw an arrow between two edges labeled by a message block whenever absorption from this message block allows to grow from the left state to the right state, and no message block when we are on the squeezing phase. And the routine node will denote all nodes which are accessible from the initial state. The security model used here is indifferentiability, and I will present it in a particular setting. So indifferentiability takes the form of a distinguishing game where the adversary is placed either in the real world or in the ideal world. And in both settings, it can make construction or primitive queries. Now, in the real world, primitive queries gives access to a random permutation and construction query on the sponge based on this permutation. Now, in the ideal world, the sponge is replaced by a random oracle and the primitive by a simulator. A simulator is an algorithm which is allowed to query the random oracle, and its goal is to provide answers matching the one of the sponge, while at the same time imitating a random permutation. Now, given a particular simulator, we say that the sponge is indifferentiable from a random oracle whenever any adversary can distinguish between these two words only with a negligible probability. And this probability is usually expressed as a function of the number of queries made. More precisely, we define the indifferentiability advantage to be the absolute value of the probability difference that the adversary in each of the words returns a particular bit. And this is maximized over all distinguishers allowed to make at most few queries. Looking ahead, we will consider the following restrictive advantage, where the max is taken over all adversaries allowed to make construction queries with a restricted message input length. One variant of indifferentiability is called public indifferentiability, and in this setting, the construction queries are made public to all parties. So in particular, in the ideal world, the simulator has access to the adversary queries to the random oracle. It makes its life easier because in particular, it only needs to maintain consistency with respect to a smaller list of past queries. Therefore, it yields a security model which is weaker than plain indifferentiability. So for example, the plain Merkle-Damgard construction is not indifferentiable, but it is publicly indifferentiable. But even if the security model is weaker, it is nonetheless useful in practice in crypto systems that do not require the data to hash to be kept secret. So for example, this is the case of several digital signature schemes. However, from now, I will mainly focus on plain indifferentiability unless explicitly stated. Now, going back to the sponge construction, soon after its introduction, it has been proven to be indifferentiable with a bound of form q squared over 2 to the c. And for the generalized sponge, this result has been extended. So namely, as long as the capacity when squeezing is no smaller than half of the capacity when absorbing, up to a logarithmic factor, then the security bound does not degrade significantly. In words, it tells us that in order to be able to differentiate the sponge from a random oracle with a non-negligible probability, one needs at least 2 to the CA over 2 queries. And it was clear from the start that this bound is tight because with this number of queries, we can generate inner collisions which allow to differentiate. More precisely, the attack works as follows. So start from the initial state, then consider 2 to the CA over 2 different messages, add them to the outer part, apply the permutation, and store the obtained states in a list. Now with high probability, there exist 2 different elements in this list that display a collision on the inner part. And the idea now is to compensate the difference in the outer part by using a subsequent absorb call. Therefore, with the notation of the slide here, we have 2 different sequences of message blocks that go to the same state Z. So we have a full state collision. 2 remarks is that this is only for the particular case when the rate is at least half of the capacity when absorbing. And in this setting, one needs to absorb call. However, this attack is easily generalizable when the rate is as small as we want. What we need to do here is to, in the first phase of the attack, we need to extend the number of absorb calls to k. K is defined here, so that the number of obtained state here is 2 to the CA over 2. So that we have an inner collision with high probability. And we can again use a subsequent absorb call to transform this partial collision into a full state collision. So that this attack requires in total k+1 absorb calls. Now, assume that we have a sponge where the number of load message block to be absorbed is restricted to L, but still we can squeeze an arbitrary number of blocks. This is a restrictive setting, which has nonetheless useful applications in crypto system where the length of the data to hash is known in advance, or at least upper bounded. So for example, password hashing or protocols using the Fiat-Shamir transform. Then in particular, when L is smaller than k+1, the collision attack from the slide before does not apply anymore. However, we can tweak it in the following way. So first of all, compute all routine nodes where absorption of a message block is still possible. Call these states YY. Then start, for example, from YY and then make chain primitive queries so that we obtain routine nodes linked associated to squeeze calls. call these states the NJs, and then look for an inner collision between a YY and an NJ. Once this is formed, we can use the last absorb call on YY to transform this partial collision into a full state collision. In particular, because the number of YY state is smaller than 2 to the CA over 2, then the number of NJs needs to compensate for that. More precisely, they must be equal to 2 to the B minus L times RA, which is greater than 2 to the CA over 2. In words, it means that there is a gap between this attack and the security bond in this restricted setting. And the contribution of this work was to prove a better indifferentiability and public indifferentiability bond for the sponge when the number of message block is restricted. And in particular, the minimum term here matches the collision attack. A related work is a bond from Naito and Ota. And when only one message block is allowed to be absorbed, then we can also use their indifferentiability bond. Here in the setting, they allow the first rate when absorbing to be larger than the subsequent rate when absorbing. So that here, this bond provides new results whenever more than one message block is absorbed. Before moving on to the proof details, a few notational points. I will use the set absorb path to denote all routine nodes where absorption of a message block is still possible. And in particular, because we assume that the permutation and the simulator defines their answers on the fly, then the size of this set can be upper bounded as the minimum between the number of queries and the size of this set when considering all possibilities. Moreover, I will say that a path is valid whenever the number of absorbed message block is smaller than calligraphic L. Now, a few words about the simulator use. It is very similar to the one used by indifferentiability of the sponge. So more precisely, the inverse simulator returns random elements, while the forward simulator will maintain consistent answers whenever this query involves a node in a valid path. Overall, the simulator behaves like a two-sided random function. And for the setting of public indifferentiability, from this simulator, we can build another simulator, which is such that whenever a new construction query is made available, then S prime is going to convert them into the appropriate primitive queries to S, so that the simulator is implicitly aware of all construction queries. Now we have ideal world versus real world. And in order to facilitate the analysis, we can introduce an intermediate world where construction queries give access to the sponge, which is itself based on the simulator, itself based on a random oracle hidden from the adversary. So now we have two different distance to bound. First one is intermediate versus real. Because in both of these worlds, construction queries give access to the sponge, then we can get rid of construction queries by letting the adversary convert them into the appropriate primitive queries. So this distance is only given by the quality of randomness of the simulator. And because it is acting like a two-sided random function, then this distance is upper bounded by the PRP-PRF switching lemma. For the remaining distance, this is an identical until bad games. And two kinds of bad events can allow an adversary to differentiate. The first one is when the simulator fails to provide answers matching the one of a sponge. Then in this case, it is easy to distinguish. And the second kind of bad event is only for the plain indifferentiability setting, because in the plain indifferentiability setting, simulator is not aware of construction queries made by the adversary, while here in the intermediate world, because the sponge makes the query to the simulator, then in the intermediate world, the simulator is more powerful. And if a certain bad event happens, then the adversary will be able to notice the difference. This bad event is called guess. It can be set only in the intermediate world and does not apply in the public indifferentiability setting. It is set whenever the adversary is able to guess an intermediate state that was generated during a construction query. More precisely, it has two possibilities. Either the adversary can guess the full state of any routine node, and because in this case it has access to the outer parts of the squeeze box, so RS bits, then this event has a probability of Q over 2 to the CS. Another possibility is that the adversary guesses the inner part of a node in absorb path, because in this setting, it can additionally overwrite up to RA bits. So that this probability is given by the minimum term. We have a minimum here because the size of absorb path can be upper bounded as the minimum between two terms. So that was the bad event guess. And for the remaining bad events, they only concern consistency of the answers. So we have inner, which is set whenever inner collisions with absorb path occur. Then we have call, which is set whenever either two primitive query inputs collide or two primitive queries output collide with each other, and it gives the term q squared over 2 to the b. So at this point, you might think that this term here has been artificially introduced only because the simulator imitates badly a random permutation. But this is not the case because we also have the bat even connect, which is set whenever a primitive query input collides with another primitive query output. And even with a random permutation, this even is set with this probability. So now that we established the bound, we might wonder about the tightness of it. So remember that we had an inner collision with this number of queries, which matches the minimum term. And now for the remaining term, well, in 2 to the CS queries, an adversary can make a construction query. It has access to RS bits and it can try all possible inner parts. So that in the set of queries made by the adversary, one of them will correspond to the adversary being able to guess the state of the sponge, which is of course an undesirable even in practice. For the other terms, we can imagine the following differentiability attack. So first, make 2 to the b over 2 different primitive queries. Then take a random message, absorb this message, and make 2 to the b over 2 chain primitive queries so that the event connect will be set with high probability. Once this is set, the adversary can check for consistency of the answers. And any simulator which is able to defeat this attack should in particular be able to guess the message that was taken by the adversary, which is of course hard in practice. And a few words about application. So if we take parameter set that correspond to ASCII hash, with a regular sponge, we had 128 bits of security, while if we restrict the input message to be of size of at most 127 bits, then security levels up to 160 bits. If we go for smaller permutation sizes, so for example, photon beetle, hash, or T-quark, with a plain sponge, we had 112 bits of security, while if we restrict again the message to be of size of at most 127 bits, then security levels up to 128 bits. However, if we already know a restriction of the message input and want to maximize security and the absorbing rate at the same time, then the best parameter choice is to have one message block absorb and rate equal to capacity equal to half of the permutation when absorbing. So to conclude, in this work, I prove the tight indifferentiability bound for the sponge construction when the number of message block is restricted. And whenever less than k+1 blocks of absorb, it gives a better security bound. Thank you for your attention.
So questions or comments from Kobe?
Thank you for nice talk. I have one question. So this is the, I think this is the result of sponge construction, but I wonder if such similar results hold for Markov-Dangard construction. I mean, the Markov-Dangard construction is secure in terms of public indifferentiability, right? So my question is, when the number of messages, when the length of messages is restricted, then does the security of Markov-Dangard construction becomes better in terms of public indifferentiability?
As far as I remember, there was one particular case of the Markov-Dangard when you have a fixed data length input, then it was even indifferentiable.
Yeah. So my question is, if the length is restricted, then does the security of Markov-Dangard increase? Or is there any?
On top of my head, I think that yes, but I can check it and we can discuss it offline if you want.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. More questions, comments? From Beijing? From the chat? So maybe I have one. So you actually have two security bounds. And I just want to make sure that when you refer to the tightness, you mean that both bounds are tight, or you just refer to the regular indifferentiability?
Actually, to both. So in the public indifferentiability, this term here does not appear. So the attack doesn't apply anymore because you don't mind that the adversary is able to guess the full state. And yes, this is also tight with, for public indifferentiability setting, having inner collision and setting the bad even connect is also tight. It's also something that applies, an attack that applies in the setting of public indifferentiability. So it's tight with respect to both.
Okay, thank you. More questions from Kobe? From Beijing? And no chat. So let's thank the speaker again. Okay. Can you share
Yes, the speaker is online and will present.
Hello. Am I
Hello,
audible?
can you share the screen?
Yeah, sure. So is my screen visible?
Yes.
We can.
And how about my audio?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great.
Okay, so the last talk of this session is about tight multi-user security bound of DBHDS. The authors are Nilanjan Datta, Avijit Dutta, Bridwan Nandi, and Suprita Karnika. And Avijit will give us a talk.
Thanks, Crystal. So good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to present my work, Tight Multi-User Security Bound of Double Block Hashed in Sum, which is a joint work with Nilanjan, Medul, and Suprita. So double block hashed in sum, or DBHDS, is a popular design paradigm of constructing beyond but the bound secured variable output length PRF, which was proposed by Datta et al. In FSC 20. So double block hashed in sum is basically constructed of two separate modules. Namely, the first one is a double block hash function, which is denoted in red, and it takes a message M of arbitrary length, and it produces two n-bit outputs, namely sigma and theta, where sigma and theta, each of them are n-bit string. And then this 2 n-bit output is fed into a sum function, and the sum function is basically the sum or the XOR of the outputs of two block ciphers, namely EK1 and EK2, and finally it produces the tag T. So authors have shown that double block hashed in sum is secure up to 2 to the 2n by 3 many queries. So before that, many of the variable output length PRF was proposed, and those are shown to be beyond but the bound secure. So I'll start with the work by Yasuda. So Yasuda in CTRSA 2010 has proposed a variable output length PRF, which is called sum ECBC. So this is nothing but the sum of the two independent CBC outputs, right? So this is a rate half sequential mode of operation, and it requires 4 independent block cipher keys, and it offers Q cube L cube over 2 to the 2n security bound. So if you see this construction closely, then this is nothing but an instantiation of double block hashed in sum. Because if you see that the red part is basically a double block hashed in sum function, which is nothing but the concatenation of two independent CBC instances. Then their output, namely sigma and theta, is passed through a sum function, namely EK2 and EK3, and finally their output is stored together to produce the tag T. After a year, Yasuda has also proposed another beyond but the bound secure variable output length PRF called PMAC plus. So it is a rate 1 parallel mode of operation, and it's unlike the sum ECBC function, sum ECBC construction, it requires 3 independent block cipher keys, and it also offers a similar level of security bound, namely Q cube L cube over 2 to the 2n. So again, if you see that this is another instantiation of the double block hashed function, double block hashed in sum function, okay, where this red part basically is the double block hash function. In Asia 2012, Chang et al. Have proposed 3KF9. It is a red font sequential mode of operation that requires 3 independent block cipher keys like PMAC plus, and again it offers Q cube L cubed over 2 to the 2n security bound. And similarly, you can see that this construction is again an instantiation of double block hash then sum. And finally, in AsiaCrypt 2017, NITHE has proposed LightMac plus construction, which is again an instantiation of DBHDS construction. Again, this is unlike the 3 previous constructions, it is a rate 1 parallel mode of operation. Like PMAC plus or 3KF9, it also requires 3 independent block cipher keys, and it offered Q cubed by 2 to the power 2n security bound. So one important thing to note here, that the security bound of LightMac plus is basically independent of the message length N, and that's why it is called that it's the first BBB secure MAC whose security bound is independent of the message length. So as we can see that all these 4 constructions are the instantiations of 3-keyed DBHDS hash function. Why is it called 3-keyed? Because if you see closely the sum function takes basically the 2 independent block cipher keys, which is different over the hash key, HKH. So altogether, the total number of keys is basically 3. So that's why all these instantiations are the instantiations of the 3-keyed DBHDS constructions. So as opposed to this, Datta et al. In FSC 20 have proposed a variant of 3-keyed DBHDS construction, which is called 2-keyed DBHDS construction, where the sum function requires only a single block cipher key. And that is obviously different from the hash key. So the sum function requires a single block cipher key, and authors have shown a similar level of security bound as 3-keyed DBHDS. Along with that, authors have also proposed 2-keyed variants of some ECBC PMAC plus and 3KF9 and LightMac plus construction, and showed a similar 2n by 3-bit security bound for each of the constructions. So till now, the summary is that all these constructions, namely some ECBC or PMAC plus, 3KF9, LightMac plus, all these constructions here are similar design principle. And the hash key is independent to the block cipher key, which is used in the sum function. And all of them have been proven secure up to 2n by 3 bits. However, all the constructions have been proven secure under the standard model and in the single user setting. In Crypto 18, Laurent et al. Have shown an attack on DBHDS with query complexity at least to power 3n by 4. And in EuroCrypt 20, Kim et al. Have improved the security bound of DBHDS from 2n by 3 bits to 3n by 4 bits. So together the two results, that means the results of Laurent et al. In Crypto 18 and Kim et al. In EuroCrypt 20, the DBHDS has been proven to achieve a tight security bound of 3n by 4 bit. Nevertheless, DBHDS construction till now have been proven secure under the standard model assumption and in the single user setting. So now a natural question can be asked that what can we say about the security of DBHDS in the multi-user setup? So before we go into that, let me explain what is the multi-user setting. So the multi-user PRF game in the standard model looks like this, that the adversary has not only access to a single instance of the actual construction, but it has access to U independent instance of the construction. So in the real world, so adversary has access to U independent instances of the actual constructions, namely CE. So basically the construction C is built on top of block cipher E. That's why it is denoted as CE. And in the ideal world, the adversary has access to U independent instances of random function. And then the adversary has to tell that which wall it has interacted with. That denotes or that defines the advantage of the algorithm A. So this is defined in the standard model. In the ideal cipher model, adversary not only have access to the actual construction, but it can also query to the underlying primitive E. So in that setting, again, we can define the advantage of algorithm A in the ideal cipher model, namely the distinguishing advantage in distinguishing the real world from the ideal world. Okay, so there's a trivial relationship between the single user security and the multi-user security. Namely, if you have a construction whose single user advantage is like epsilon, then you can trivially deduce the multi-user advantage of that construction by an upper bound, which is basically the number of users times the single user advantage, which is like epsilon. So U times epsilon. So for example, if you consider the PRF advantage of double block hash then sum, then as we know that the single user PRF advantage of double block hash then sum is Q to the 4 over 3 over 2 power n. So as a result of that, if you just plug in this relation, then you can easily compute the multi-user PRF advantage of DBHDS, which is U times Q to the power 4 by 3 over 2 power n. So this bound is more or less good when the number of users is less, but when the number of users reaches to the number of queries, namely when U is basically order of Q, then the bound degrades to Q to the 7 by 3 over 2 power n, which is worse than the Bernoulli bound. So therefore, in order to analyze the security of a double block Hash sum construction or any kind of construction, then the trivial reduction actually might not give you a desired bound. So as a result of that, we actually require a direct analysis of the double block Hash sum construction in the multi-user setting than relying on a generic reduction. So in order to study the multi-user security of the DBHDS construction, Shen et al. Have started the work. So they have started analyzing the 2-key DBHDS construction in the multi-user setup under the ideal cipher model assumption. And authors have shown that 2-key DBHDS construction is secure up to 2 to the 2n by 3 queries in the multi-user setting under the ideal cipher model assumption. And authors have also instantiated 2-key DBHDS with 2K sum ECBC, 2K PMAC plus, 2K F9, 2K LikeMac plus, which are the 2-key variants of DBHDS construction, and showed their 2n by 3-bit multi-user security in ideal cipher model. However, some of their results have been pointed out as flawed, which was pointed out recently by Guo and Wang. So the Guo and Wang pointed out the following flaw of the constructions proposed by Shen et al., that the security bound of the construction was shown to be incorrect when the underlying double block hash function was instantiated with 2 independent instances of polyhash function and 2 independent instances of CBC hash function. And the flaw basically cropped up because the authors have incorrectly argued the probability of cross-collision event. So cross-collision event means when you have the sigma I equal to theta j and sigma j equal to theta I for 2 different queries I and j. And authors have assumed that these 2 events are independent, whereas for the polyhash and the CBC hash function, these 2 events have been shown to be not independent. So as a result of that, their bound does not hold true for these 2 instantiations. So upon finding out the flaw, Guo and Wang have notified the authorship et al., and they have revised their paper based on the findings of Guo and Wang, and then they revised their paper and introduced another event which is called the cover-free event, the notion which was introduced by Datta et al. In FSC 20. So the summary is that Shen et al. Proved 2n by 3-bit multi-user security of 2K DBHDS in the ideal cipher model, whereas the initial version of the paper contained a flawed analysis, but later on it was corrected by the authors. But hold on, there are more to explore. So the security analysis of the instantiations, which was proposed by Shen et al., have not been done in the ideal cipher model. And moreover, the good transcript analysis for proving the security of DBHDS is incorrect, as they have used the sum of permutation result over 0 and power n, whereas it should have been analyzed over a restricted set. That means we should have analyzed the sum of permutation result over a restricted set, not over the entire domain 0 and power n. So here comes our result, that we have shown the multi-user security of 2K DBHDS up to 2 to the 3n by 4 queries in the ideal cipher model. But in order to prove the security, we have a couple of assumptions. The first assumption is that the underlying hash function has to be good. So here we have assumed that the hash function is basically the concatenation of 2 n-bit hash function, namely h1 and h2, and we call the double block hash function h to be good if it satisfies the following condition, namely each of the n-bit hash functions has to be individually universal and regular, and the probability of the cross-collision event between h1 and h2 should be 0. And then we have instantiated the good double block hash function through 2 independent instances of polyhash function using the domain separation technique. And we have also shown that the instantiated kind of constructions achieve 3n by 4-bit multi-user security in the ideal cipher model. Just a quick glimpse of the security proof. So in order to prove the security, we actually resorted to the edge coefficient technique, which is a popular framework for proving the distinguishability of 2 random systems, where we actually need to consider the bad events, and we have to bound the probability of the bad events in the ideal world. And finally, for a good transcript, we have to lower bound the ratio of the real to ideal interpolation probability for the good transcript. Okay, so we started with the bad events. So first of all, we have to identify the cycle in the tuple sigma and theta. So we need to avoid a cycle of length 2. That means for 2 different queries I and j, if there's a simultaneous collision in the sigma theta value, namely sigma equal to sigma j and theta equal to theta j. We call these 2 events to be bad if sigma I and sigma j collides for 2 different queries, as well as their tag also collides. Similarly, for two different queries, if their theta value collides and t collides. So if this basically happens, then that basically leads to the permutation incompatibility. However, we have to allow the collision of sigma and the collision of theta, right? But we do not allow it to be very big, right? So we actually need to have a bound on the number of colliding pairs of sigma and theta. Namely, if the number of colliding pairs in the sigma values reaches q to the power 2 by 3, or if the number of colliding pairs in the theta values reaches q to the power 2 by 3, then we call it to be bad. Finally, we have to also restrict the number of length of the path, right? We call it the alternating path of length 4, which says if there is a quadruple of queries, namely I, j, k, and l, such that the sigma values between the ith and jth query collides, the theta values between the jth and kth query collide, and the sigma value between the kth and lth query collides, right? So if you just draw it using a vertices, where the vertices represent the sigma theta value, then you can easily find it basically completes a path where the edges of the path basically alternates between blue and green. Similarly, we have a symmetrical event where we have a quadruple of queries where the theta value between ith and jth query collides, the sigma value between jth and kth query collides, and the theta value between kth and lth query collides. So all these bad events basically related to the construction queries, but we also need to consider the collision between the ideal cipher query. So namely, we need to identify, or we need to consider the key input collision in the ideal cipher queries to be bad. Namely, if there's a collision between between the key of the ith user, namely ki, which collides with the ideal cipher key jj, and their corresponding sigma value collides with the ideal cipher primitive query. Similarly, if the ith user key collides with the ideal cipher key jj, and their theta value also collides with the ideal cipher query. We also need to consider the key input collision in construction queries, namely for two different users, ith users and jth user, their key collides as well as their sigma value collides. Similarly, for the theta case as well, that for ith and jth user, their key collides and their theta value also collides. And finally, we do not need the simultaneous collision between the block cipher key and the hash key of two different users. Namely, for the ith user and the jth user, if their block cipher key collides and their hash key collides, then we call it to be bad. Finally, summing up all these bad events, we have bounded the probability of those bad events in the ideal world. And if you assume that the regular and the universal advantage of the underlying hash function is epsilon, then it roughly achieves q to the power 4 by 3 by 2 power n security bound in the bad case. So now if you just take a good transcript, which does not satisfy all the previous listed bad events, then we analyzed the real interpolation probability of that good transcript using the mirror theory result, which was developed by Krim et al. In Eurocrypt 20 to derive the desired 3n by 4 bit bound. So to wrap up my talk, so we have improved the multi-user security bound of DBHDS construction from 2n by 3 bits to 3n by 4 bits. Due to the result of Lennon et al. At Crypto 2018, our proven bound is tight. However, our result does not address the block cipher-based double block hash function. Namely, if you just instantiate the underlying hash function using a block cipher, then our security result does not, directly is applicable to bound the double block hash function, which is entirely built up with the block cipher. As a result, our result cannot be applied for proving the 3n by 4 bit multi-user security of block cipher-based DBHDS construction. So to prove the security of such DBHDS construction, one needs to derive the regular and the universal advantage of underlying block cipher-based double block hash function in the ideal cipher model, which we believe is a quite challenging open problem. And that's all. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. So questions or comments from Kobe? Yes.
Hello, thank you for the talk. So I have one question. Maybe I actually have two questions, but they are related. Yes, now I'm actually talking to you because your face is here. That's convenient. So first question is, why actually do you look at the ideal cipher model and not the standard model?
Well, the security of DBHDS construction has already been proven in the standard model, and you cannot do it better than 3n by 4 because it's already a tight bound. So people are really interested to look at the ideal cipher model. I mean, if the adversary has access to the block cipher, then how the security bound degrades of double block hash and sum construction.
So in a standard model, there is already a 3n/4 bound.
Yes. And basically, as I've shown, that if you have a so basically we need to analyze the construction in the multi-user setup. So you cannot really apply the generic reduction. That means you cannot just multiply the number of users with a single user advantage, because that will give you a worse bound than the bound. So you need a direct analysis of the construction using the multi-user setup. And we have assumed that, okay, if in fact the adversary can evaluate the block cipher in its own. So what will happen if the block cipher is evaluated by the adversary? Then how the security of double block hash and sum degrades.
Okay, yes. So this generic reduction that would work for a standard model, it just doesn't work for the ideal cipher model. So that was
yes,
my
exactly.
second question. But okay, so then I don't have a second question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the question.
More questions from Kobe? From Beijing? The chat is silent. Maybe I have one. Can you go back to the 2 pages before showing your bounds? Yeah, that one. So can you clarify which one is a dominating term that shows 3n/4-bit security? So there are many terms there, and I'm not sure which one is the strongest.
So first of all, I have assumed that k is greater than n. The key size is at least the block size. So I think k and q and p roughly of the same order. So again, I do not assume, or I have not assumed that p can go up to 2 to the k. So the bound on p is roughly 2 power 3k by 4, right? And similarly, the bound on q is roughly 2 power 3n by 4. But if you assume the bound of p, which goes up to 2 to the 3k by 4, then this bound 4q to the power 4 by 3 epsilon, where epsilon is 2 to the n. So that is the dominating bound.
Okay. Thank you. And more?
Yeah. Thanks, Asim. Yeah.
Questions? Okay, let's thank the speaker.
Thank you.
And we now have a break, and we will start the next session at 4 in Kobe and 3 in Beijing.